Magnolia. "You knew, of course, that Mrs. Black was going to build an extension to her house." "Yes, ma'am. I hear it is to run right back to the end of the yard. How she can afford to build an extension in these hard times I don't see. But she always was crazy about building. She used to keep a boarding house in 17th Street, and she nearly ruined herself then by sticking out bow windows and what not. I should have thought that that would have cured her of building. But I guess it's a disease like drink. Anyhow, the work is to begin on Monday." Mrs. Manstey had grown pale. She always spoke slowly, so the landlady did not heed the long pause which followed. At last Mrs. Manstey said, "Do you know how high the extension will be?" "That's the most absurd part of it. The extension is to be built right up to the roof of the main building. Now, did you ever?" Mrs. Manstey paused again. "Won't it be a great annoyance to you, Mrs. Sampson?" she asked. "I should say it would. But there's no help for it. If people have a mind to build extensions, there's no law to prevent 'em, that I'm aware of." Mrs. Manstey, knowing this, was silent. "There is no help for it," Mrs. Sampson repeated. "But if I am a church member, I wouldn't be so sorry if it ruined Eliza Black. Well, good day, Mrs. Manstey. I'm glad to find you so comfortable." So comfortable! So comfortable! Left to herself, the old woman turned once more to the window. How lovely the view was that day! The blue sky with its round clouds shed a brightness over everything. The ailanthus had put a tinge of yellow-green. The hyacinths were budding. The magnolia flowers looked more than ever like rosettes carved in alabaster. Soon the wisteria would bloom, then the horse-chestnut. But not for her. Between her eyes and them a barrier of brick and mortar would swiftly rise. Presently even the spire would disappear, and all her radiant world be blotted out. Mrs. Manstey sent away untouched the dinner tray brought to her that evening. She lingered in the window until the windy sunset died in bat-colored dusk. Then, going to bed, she lay sleepless all night. Early the next day she was up and at the window. It was raining, but even through the slanting gray gauze the scene had its charm. And then the rain was so good for the trees. She had noticed the day before that the ailanthus was growing dusty. "Of course I might move," said Mrs. Manstey aloud, and turning from the window she looked about her room. She might move, of course. So might she be flayed alive. But she was not likely to survive either operation. The room, though far less important to her happiness than the view, was as much a part of her existence. She had lived in it 17 years. She knew every stain on the wallpaper, every rent in the carpet. The light fell in a certain way on her engravings. Her books had grown shabby on their shelves. Her bulbs and ivy were used to their window and knew which way to lean to the sun. "We are all too old to move," she said. That afternoon it cleared. Wet and radiant, the blue reappeared through torn rags of cloud. The ailanthus sparkled. The earth and the flower borders looked rich and warm. It was Thursday, and on Monday the building of the extension was to begin. On Sunday afternoon a card was brought to Mrs. Black, as she was engaged in gathering up the fragments of the boarders' dinner in the basement. The card, black-edged, bore Mrs. Manstey's name. "One of Mrs. Sampson's boarders wants to move, I suppose." "Well, I can give her a room next year in the extension, Dinah," said Mrs. Black. "Tell the lady I'll be upstairs in a minute." Mrs. Black found Mrs. Manstey standing in the long parlor garnished with statuettes and antimacassars. In that house she could not sit down. Stooping hurriedly to open the register, which let out a cloud of dust, Mrs. Black advanced on her visitor. "I'm happy to meet you, Mrs. Manstey. Take a seat, please." the landlady remarked in her prosperous voice, the voice of a woman who can afford to build extensions. There was no help for it. Mrs. Manstey sat down. "Is there anything I can do for you, ma'am?" Mrs. Black continued. "My house is full at present, but I am going to build an extension, and it's about the extension that I wish to speak," said Mrs. Manstey suddenly. "I'm a poor woman, Mrs. Black, and I have never been a happy one. I shall have to talk about myself first to make you understand." Mrs. Black, astonished by the imperturbable, bowed at this parenthesis. "I never had what I wanted," Mrs. Manstey continued. "It was always one disappointment after another. For years I wanted to live in the country. I dreamed and dreamed about it, but we never could manage it. There was no sunny window in our house, and so all my plants died. My daughter married years ago and went away, and besides, she never cared for the same things. Then my husband died, and I was left alone. That was 17 years ago. I went to live at Mrs. Sampson's, and I have been there ever since. I have grown a little infirm, as you see, and I don't get out often, only on fine days if I'm feeling very well. So you can understand my sitting a great deal in my window, the back window on the 3rd floor." "Well, Mrs. Manstey," said Mrs. Black liberally, "I could give you a back room, I dare say, one of the new rooms in the But I don't want to move. I can't move," said Mrs. Manstey, almost with a scream. "And I came to tell you that if you build that extension I shall have no view from my window. No view. Do you understand?" Mrs. Black thought herself face to face with a lunatic, and she had always heard that lunatics must be humored. Dear me," she remarked, pushing her chair back a little way. "That is too bad, isn't it? Why, I never thought of that. To be sure, the extension will interfere with your view, Mrs. Manstey." You do understand?" Mrs. Manstey gasped. "Of course I do, and I'm real sorry about it, too. But there, don't you worry, Mrs. Manstey. I guess we can fix that all right." Mrs. Manstey rose from her seat, and Mrs. Black slipped toward the door. "What do you mean by fixing it? Do you mean that I can induce you to change your mind about the extension? Oh, Mrs. Black, listen to me. I have $2,000 in the bank, and I know I could manage to give you 1,000 if—" Mrs. Manstey paused. The tears were rolling down her cheeks. There, Mrs. Manstey, don't you worry," repeated Mrs. Black soothingly. "I am sure we can settle it. I am sorry that I can't stay and talk about it any longer, but this is such a busy time of day, with supper to get." Her hand was on the doorknob, but with sudden vigor Mrs. Manstey seized her wrist. "You are not giving me a definite answer. Do you mean to say that you accept my proposition?" "Why, I'll think it over, Mrs. Manstey. Certainly I will. I wouldn't annoy you for the world." "But the work is to begin tomorrow, I am told," Mrs. Manstey persisted. Mrs. Black hesitated. "It shan't begin, I promise you that. I'll send word to the builder this very night." Mrs. Manstey tightened her hold. "You are not deceiving me, are you?" she said. No," stammered Mrs. Black. "How can you think such a thing of me, Mrs. Manstey?" Slowly Mrs. Manstey's clutch relaxed, and she passed through the open door. $1,000, she repeated, pausing in the hall. Then she let herself out of the house and hobbled down the steps, supporting herself on the cast-iron railing. "My goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Black, shutting and bolting the hall door. "I never knew the old woman was crazy. And she looks so quiet and ladylike, too." Mrs. Manstey slept well that night, but early the next morning she was awakened by a sound of hammering. She got to her window with what haste she might, and looking out saw that Mrs. Black's yard was full of workmen. Some were carrying loads of brick from the kitchen to the yard, others beginning to demolish the old-fashioned wooden balcony which